Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Get ready, because today we're time traveling to ancient Egypt. But we're not just admiring pyramids from afar. We're getting right down to the most fundamental challenge this incredible civilization faced. The mighty, unpredictable Nile River.
Yeah.
How did they not just survive living next to it, but actually shape its power to build one of history's greatest societies?
And our focus is specifically on the Old Kingdom and the following First Intermediate period. So that's roughly 2686 to 2055 BC.
Right.
And you really can't overstate how central the Nile was. Managing that annual flood wasn't just about farming. It was, the backbone for building everything, the cities, the pyramids, the entire state.
And to figure this out, we've gone deep into the sources you shared with us. We're talking archaeological finds, actual pieces of ancient dams, canals, even surprising bits of plumbing.
Yeah, some amazing finds.
Alongside ancient inscriptions carved thousands of years ago, tomb art, and cutting-edge modern geoarchaeology. We've got all this material, and our mission is to pull out the absolute most important, most surprising insights just for you.
What's truly fascinating when you look at these sources is the level of sophistication they achieved, often with, relatively simple technology.
Right.
They weren't using modern pumps or huge concrete structures, but they developed hydraulic engineering ideas that were foundational, really foundational, and lasted for thousands of years.
Okay, let's unpack this. The story starts, as everything in Egypt did, with the basic rhythm of the Nile.
Yeah.
That incredible annual flood.
Absolutely. The inundation, they called it a Ket season, usually July to October. And you're right, it wasn't seen primarily as a disaster. It was the lifeblood. It would cover the floodplain, depositing this incredibly rich, fertile silt washed down from the Ethiopian highlands.
So their whole farming system had to be built around this temporary sea, basically.
Exactly. The core method was what we call basin irrigation. Imagine the floodplain wasn't just one flat area, but was naturally divided into these huge sections, or basins, by slightly higher ground.
Okay.
The Egyptians enhanced this. They created or strengthened earth embankments, basically dikes around these basins.
So you're creating like giant temporary wading tools for farming. Is that the idea?
Precisely. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. When the Nile rose, they'd open cuts in the main river levees or use short feeder canals to channel the floodwater into these diked basins.
Okay.
They'd let the water sit there, soak the soil for maybe 6 to 10 months. That saturated the land, let all that valuable silt settle out.
Got it.
Then they'd open other cuts or maybe simple gates to drain the excess water back as the river receded, or sometimes into lower basins further inland. And then you plant. Simple as that, but on a massive scale.
But it wasn't purely passive flooding, right?
Yeah.
The sources show by the Old Kingdom, they were adding quite a bit of human control.
Oh, yes, definitely. They weren't just waiting for the river to spill over wherever. They were actively digging those feeder canals to make sure water got to specific basins, maybe ones that wouldn't flood well naturally.
Yeah.
They used simple mud brick sluice gates. Think of them as like primitive stoppers or regulators to control when water entered or left a basin and how much.
Oh.
And they also built stronger dikes along the river itself, and crucially, transverse dikes running perpendicular to the river, inland, to make the basins more defined and manageable units.
So they were really engineering a more reliable, sort of controlled version of the natural flood cycle. What were the big limitations of this system, though?
Well, while it was brilliant for maximizing the benefits of an average flood and could help manage slightly high or low floods, the main limitation was timing. It was all tied to that one annual flood event.
Right.
You only got one major saturation and one main planting season right after the water receded. Perennial irrigation, watering fields year-round for multiple crops just wasn't possible on a large scale with this system.
So no second harvest from the same fields.
Not really, not from the main basin fields. Any irrigation outside the flood season was minimal, mostly just lifting water manually with buckets for, small vegetable gardens near the riverbank.
Manually lifting water sounds exhausting.
It was. And the simpler water lifting devices, like the shadowy, that lever and bucket system, they didn't become common until much, much later, after 1500 BCE, well after our period.
So their strategy was fundamentally about optimizing and controlling the annual flood, not trying to fight the river or redirect it for constant watering across the board.
That's it, exactly. It was an approach focused on working with the flood's pulse using extensive earthworks and a massive amount of coordinated manual labor, not the kind of large-scale river diversion and reservoir systems you'd need for perennial irrigation.
And given how absolutely vital that flood was, too little meant famine, too much meant destruction. They had to know what was coming, right? How did they predict or measure the flood height each year?
They monitored it meticulously. They used structures we call nilometers. Now, we don't have many physical nilometers surviving from the Old Kingdom itself that are definitively dated.
Okay.
But the practice of recording flood heights is clearly documented. The Palermo stone, those royal annals from the 5th dynasty, it lists the peak flood height for each year, going back centuries.
Wow.
And it uses precise measurements, cubits, palms, and fingers.
Like keeping a sophisticated ancient tide chart just for the river. Why was that measurement so crucial? What did it tell them?
Everything, basically. It was directly tied to prosperity or the lack of it. The flood height determined how much land would be effectively irrigated and therefore the potential crop yields.
So taxes.
Exactly. Crop yields determine state grain taxes, the food supply for the entire population, rations for workers, everything. Priests and officials tracked it religiously, and key monitoring stations were likely placed at strategic points, like Elephantine Island, way down south near the First Cataract, because that's where the flood crest arrived first as it moved downstream from Nubia. Monitoring it there gave them some advance warning, maybe a few weeks, about what was heading north towards the main agricultural lands.
And source mentions this wasn't just practical, it had divine significance too.
Oh, absolutely. Maintaining the ideal flood, neither too low nor too high, as some texts put it, was considered a primary duty of the pharaoh.
Really?
Yes, it was directly tied to his role in maintaining cosmic order, what they called ma'at. A successful, balanced flood was proof the pharaoh was ruling justly and was in favor with the gods.
Wow.
So monitoring the water wasn't just about economics, it was woven deeply into their religious and political ideology.
So even something as seemingly basic as farming and measuring the river had these incredible layers of engineering, administration, and deep religious meaning all tied together. That's fascinating.
It really shows you how integrated their entire worldview was with the Nile's power and rhythm.
Okay, let's shift from the fields now to something on an even grander scale. The sources talk about using water not just for farming, but for protecting major cities and even helping build the pyramids.
Yes, this is where it gets really ambitious. One of the earliest, almost legendary feats is the story of King Menes supposedly diverting the Nile to protect Memphis.
The old kingdom capital.
Exactly. Later accounts, famously from the Greek historian Herodotus, claim Menes, the traditional unifier of Egypt around 3100 BCE, built this absolutely colossal dike.
A dike.
Yes, a massive earthwork, supposedly to actually reroute the main channel of the Nile River eastward. The goal was to create dry, flood-protected land where he could found his new capital city, the White Walls, Memphis.
And Herodotus claimed that dike was still there being maintained centuries later when he visited Egypt.
Which is incredible, right? Now, while the specifics about Menes himself and that exact event are debated by historians, Menes is a somewhat shadowy figure. The archaeological and geological evidence does confirm that massive-scale river management did take place in that Memphis area very early in Egyptian history. Human intervention significantly altered the Nile's course there.
So they really did shift the river.
They shifted it eastward, yes, creating a large, permanently flood-protected zone that was perfect for establishing a major, lasting capital like Memphis. So in a fundamental sense, they did essentially move the river to build their city.
That's just breathtaking ambition right at the dawn of unified Egypt.
It was a foundational act of hydroengineering. It literally reshaped the landscape to serve the state. And Memphis continued its close relationship with water.
How so?
Well, we have evidence of extensive canals linking its harbors to the main Nile channel and also extending inland, making it a major transport hub. And geoarchaeological studies looking at soil cores show they had to constantly keep raising and reinforcing those protective dikes over the centuries as the city grew and the land level slowly rose from natural silt deposition.
Okay, but you teased something even more surprising. How did water help build the pyramids at Giza? That site feels pretty far inland from where the Nile flows today.
That's the key. The Nile Channel wasn't exactly where it is now, and maybe more importantly, its flood level was generally higher back in the Old Kingdom. Egyptologists suspected for a long time they must have used waterways, but the recent evidence is incredibly strong.
What kind of evidence? This sounds like it completely changes how we picture the logistics of pyramid building.
It really does. The most compelling piece is the Diary of Mirror.
Okay, what's that?
It's a papyrus logbook found relatively recently, written by a mid-level official, an inspector named Merer, during the reign of Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid.
Wow.
Merer's log describes his crew transporting beautiful white Tura limestone blocks. These were for the pyramid's outer casing by boat. And he says they sailed to Akhet Khufu, which means the horizon of Khufu, the pyramid itself.
By boat?
By boat. And crucially, he talks about mooring their boats at a place called Shikufu. Scholars interpret this as the Pool of Khufu, a purpose-built harbor or basin right there near the base of the Giza Pyramid complex.
A harbor right next to the pyramid. So they were bringing these enormous stones directly by boat, not hauling them for miles over land from the river.
Exactly. This is a revolutionary insight. Mirer's diary, combined with extensive archaeological fieldwork and geoarchaeological analysis looking at sediment cores and landforms. It all strongly supports the idea that the Egyptians engineered a major harbor system at Giza.
How?
They basically redirected Nile waters during the flood season right into the floodplain immediately adjacent to the Giza Plateau. Surveys have found clear traces of ancient basins, canals, and docking areas just southwest of the Great Pyramid near the Valley Temples.
So during the flood season when the Nile was high, the water came right up to the construction site.
Yes. During the annual inundation, the water level was high enough, and through a carefully constructed network of canals branching off the main river, they could bring boats laden with stone directly from distant quarries, like Tura on the other side of the Nile, straight to the Giza Plateau edge. Mirer's diary documents this as a routine activity.
This wasn't just passively using the flood then. The sources emphasize that engineers intervened in the floodplain.
Oh, definitely. This wasn't just luck. They created a temporary but large artificial lake or port system right there. This required significant hydraulic manipulation, possibly involving temporary earth dams or sluice gates, to keep the water at the required level near the plateau edge for the months needed during the building season.
So the Giza Pyramid project wasn't just a masonry feat.
No, it incorporated sophisticated water infrastructure as an absolutely essential logistics system. Transporting those millions of tons of stone would have been vastly harder otherwise.
And this harbor idea wasn't just for Giza. Other pyramid sites, too.
Evidence suggests similar setups likely existed at other major Old Kingdom pyramid complexes like Abu Sir and Saqqara. If you look at the layouts, the causeways leading from the Riverside Valley temples up to the pyramids often seem aligned with traces of ancient canals or water basins. The entire royal funerary complex was often strategically positioned to be directly accessible by water.
It's just incredible to think about the scale of that planning. Moving rivers, building harbors just to build tombs. Okay, what about water within the buildings themselves? The sources mention something really unexpected here.
Yes, this is one of the most surprising details from the archaeology, I think. At the mortuary temple of King Sahir, he was a 5th dynasty pharaoh at the site of Abu Sir. Archaeologists excavating in 1994 discovered clear evidence of the earliest known use of actual metal pipes for plumbing.
Wait, plumbing? With metal pipes 4,500 years ago, like indoor drainage systems.
For drainage, yes, exactly. They found quite an extensive network of copper pipes. We're talking hundreds of meters in total length, carefully laid beneath the temple's stone floors and even running down along the covered causeway that led away from the temple.
What on earth were these pipes used for inside of Pharaoh's mortuary temple?
They connected to a series of beautifully crafted stone basins located in different ritual areas within the temple complex.
Basins for what?
For ceremonial washing, primarily. Things like purifying statues of the king or the gods, performing libations, rinsing offering tables after rituals. After use, this ritual water was considered impure, maybe ritually contaminated.
Wow.
It couldn't just be left to soak into the floor or spilled haphazardly. It had to be safely and discreetly removed from the sacred space. So water from these basins and maybe runoff from washing the floors would flow into channels cut into the stone pavement and then into this hidden network of copper piping beneath. This network then carried the water downhill underneath the long causeway and discharged it away from the temple complex. probably into a simple ditch or soak-away pit.
And the sources even mention cool little details like copper-lined basins with lead plugs and these wild lion-headed spouts on the outside.
Absolutely. Some of the stone basins had thin copper sheets lining them, maybe for durability or ritual reasons, and they found evidence of lead plugs used to stopper the drains in these basins.
Uh,
And on the exterior walls of the temple, there were these impressive carved stone lion gargoyles. Water collected from the roof or upper floors would spout out through the lions' mouths. Lions were powerful symbols of protection, so having them expel the water was probably symbolic, neutralizing its impurity as it left the sacred precinct. It was a really sophisticated drainage system using copper, a durable material.
that really highlights their precision engineering. Protecting those intricate carved walls and painted floors from constant water damage would have required very careful planning.
Exactly. Now, it's important to note they weren't piping fresh water into the temple with these copper systems like modern plumbing. It was purely for drainage, for removing used or waste water.
Right.
But their use of copper pipes for this purpose shows a clear understanding of how to control water flow within a complex building. It's essentially an early form of managing wastewater from a specialized high-status space. And other 5th Dynasty temples at Abu Sir show similar, though maybe less elaborate, drainage systems, suggesting this was a developed technology for these elite royal buildings.
What about regular houses, though? Or even palaces? Did everyday Egyptians or even nobles have this kind of high-tech plumbing?
Unfortunately, we know much less about that, mainly because everyday towns and cities from this period are very poorly preserved compared to stone temples and tombs.
Ugh.
We do have some evidence from the workers' village at Giza, simple stone-lined conduits, and maybe soak-away pits for managing gray water from washing or cooking. There's even a limestone seat found there that many archaeologists believe is a primitive toilet seat, suggesting basic waste disposal was considered, at least in some organized settlements.
So maybe not copper pipes everywhere, but at least some thought put into drainage in denser areas.
Yes, it seems likely that for elite houses or palaces, they probably had designated washing areas with simple drains leading perhaps to outside cesspits or maybe channels in the street. But compared to contemporary civilizations in, say, Mesopotamia or certainly later Rome, we don't see evidence of extensive citywide street drainage networks from the Old Kingdom.
So how did they manage waste, generally?
They probably relied more on the porous desert soil to absorb waste liquids, or maybe manual removal of solid waste. The architectural priority seems to have been protecting the structures themselves from water damage using raised foundations, having drainage holes or weep holes in walls to let moisture out rather than complex systems for piping water into or waste out of buildings generally. Even the Great Sphinx complex had channels cut around its enclosure, likely to divert rainwater runoff and prevent erosion. So the temple plumbing was really cutting-edge technology, applied specifically to these important sacred spaces, while general urban water use and drainage remained much more basic.
That seems to be the picture the sources paint for this period, yeah.
No, all this sophisticated engineering sounds incredibly impressive, especially for the time. But the sources also show this whole system was put to a brutal, brutal test during the first intermediate period. What happened there?
Yeah, this was a time of major upheaval. It followed the collapse of the centralized Old Kingdom state, so you had political fragmentation. Power devolved to local governors.
And critically, this political instability seems to have coincided with severe environmental stress. Around 2200 BCE, the sources point to evidence of a major climate event, what scientists often call the 4.2 kill-year event.
What did that mean for Egypt?
It likely caused a significant and prolonged drop in the monsoon rains that feed the Nile sources, particularly the Blue Nile and Atbara rivers in Ethiopia. For Egypt, this meant years, maybe even decades, of consistently low Nile floods.
Which meant disaster.
Exactly. Prolonged drought and devastating famine followed. The whole agricultural system based on the inundations started to fail.
Texts from this period are incredibly bleak, aren't they? Talking about famine, social chaos, breakdown of order. How did their carefully designed water management system hold up when the basic resource, the flood itself, failed so badly?
Well, the scientific evidence backs up the harrowing texts. We see geological signs of drought, desert dunes encroaching on previously cultivated land near the floodplain, the large natural lake Karun in the Fayum shrinking significantly.
Yeah.
And the human cost described in the inscriptions is just horrifying. They speak of widespread starvation, people resorting to desperate measures, social order collapsing. This crisis starkly revealed the fundamental limitations of a system that ultimately relied on the natural magnitude of the flood. When the flood consistently failed, the system broke down catastrophically in many areas.
And with the central government in disarray, how did local leaders cope? Could they do anything?
This is where the sources highlight local resilience, or at least the attempt at it. With the pharaoh's authority weakened, the provincial governors, the nomarchs, had to take charge of trying to save their own regions. Their tomb inscriptions from this period are absolutely vital sources for understanding what happened.
Like that incredibly stark inscription of Enctafi of Moala. That one always stands out.
Exactly. Enctafi's tomb biography is famous. He graphically describes the famine's severity, boasting that all of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger to the point where everyone was eating their children. Horrific stuff. But then he claims he saved his own province, his nome. He says, "I gave bread to the hungry and water to the thirsty." There's even one line that some scholars translate as, "I acted as water giver at midday," suggesting he was personally involved in extraordinary, perhaps desperate measures to find and distribute water when the Nile itself had failed.
So these local leaders weren't just maybe handing out stored grain, they were actively trying to find and move what little water was available.
That's the strong implication from texts like Enctipaphis and others. Analysis suggests that the more proactive nomarchs undertook local hydraulic projects on their own initiative. Things like digging canals deeper to reach lower water levels, excavating wells, maybe draining marshy areas to try and utilize trapped groundwater, anything to mitigate the drought's impact within their specific territory.
So real local engineering efforts.
Yes. Another tomb text from the period mentions a leader named Keti who claimed he dug a new canal, supposedly 10 meters wide, to divert precious water, and also built dams and drained swamps specifically for irrigation during the crisis.
These sound like heroic, but maybe ultimately limited, local efforts against a massive problem.
They were certainly local in scale, absolutely. They required significant organization and labor just within that one province or nome. And the very fact that these leaders boasted so prominently about these water provisioning efforts in their eternal tombs shows how absolutely critical this function was for their legitimacy and survival during this chaotic period. Keeping your region watered and fed was paramount.
Makes sense.
However, it's also clear that even these desperate local efforts couldn't fully overcome the multi-year failure of the Nile inundation across the country. Many areas still suffered terribly. The whole crisis served as a brutal lesson. The sustainability of Egypt's basin irrigation system didn't just depend on the flood arriving each year, but also on continual, organized human maintenance of the canals, the dikes, the whole infrastructure.
Because if that maintenance lapsed, maybe due to the political chaos, even a low flood wouldn't reach where it needed to go. Channels would silt up, dikes would breach.
Precisely. The first intermediate period showed that neglecting that essential upkeep, combined with a severe environmental shock like this drought, could rapidly turn fertile land back into unproductive wasteland. When the central regime faltered, it fell entirely to local leaders, and the results seem to have varied dramatically across the country depending on their resources and effectiveness. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this period of profound hardship and near collapse fundamentally shaped the subsequent era, the Middle Kingdom.
How so?
When Egypt was eventually reunified under strong central rule again, the new Middle Kingdom pharaohs explicitly emphasized a much more centrally coordinated approach to irrigation and land management. They presented themselves very clearly as the shepherds of the people, whose primary duty was ensuring the Nile's bounty and feeding the populace. This was a direct political and ideological lesson learned from the famine and breakdown of the first intermediate period. They knew national stability and their own power depended on mastering the erratic Nile more effectively.
So pulling it all together now, looking back at the Old Kingdom and FIP, what were the key engineering principles these ancient Egyptians developed and relied on?
Several core ideas really emerged from the sources. Firstly, there was this brilliant practical use of readily available local materials, primarily Nile mud for bricks and dikes, sand, local stone, and some wood. The big earthworks, the dikes, were mostly just compacted earth, sometimes faced with stone for durability.
And they clearly learned from failure too, didn't they? The sources mentioned that traumatic story of the failed Wadi Garawi Dam.
Ah, yes, the Saad al-Kafara Dam. This is a fascinating case study. Located in a desert wadi, not on the Nile itself, near modern Helwan, south of Cairo. This was attempted very early, late 3rd or maybe early 4th dynasty. It was intended to be a massive water storage dam, one of the earliest large dams anywhere in the world. Huge for its time, over 100 meters long at the crest, maybe 14 meters high, and incredibly wide at the base, almost 100 meters thick. A massive undertaking.
But it failed completely.
Catastrophically, and apparently before it was even finished. The evidence suggests a sudden, intense desert downpour sent a massive flash flood roaring down the wadi.
Wow.
And the dam structure, particularly the incomplete central section, was breached and largely washed away.
Why did it fail? What was the fatal design flaw?
The critical issue seems to have been the complete lack of a spillway or any kind of controlled overflow mechanism. They built this massive barrier across the wadi, but they hadn't incorporated any way for excess floodwater, especially the violent high-velocity flows you get in desert flash floods, to pass safely through or over the dam without destroying the structure itself.
So the water just built up and broke through.
Exactly. It likely overtopped the incomplete middle section and just tore it apart. A very hard lesson in dam engineering.
You could say that.
A brutal one, and its dramatic failure seems to have had a lasting impact. The sources show no similar attempts at such large-scale dam building, especially for storage in wadis, for roughly 800 years, not until the Middle Kingdom when they tried again, likely with lessons learned. It was a bold early attempt that showed they could mobilize labor and move earth and stone on a grand scale, but they clearly hadn't yet mastered the complex hydraulics required for managing unpredictable, high-energy floods in that kind of environment. Beyond that dramatic example, their core principles involved understanding simple gravity flow for canals, using those mud brick plugs or simple wooden gates as primitive sluices to direct and hold back water. Their intervention was strategic. It was focused on augmenting and controlling the natural basin system, not totally redesigning the river.
And that basin and dike network was really the enduring core of their system.
Absolutely. They took the natural floodplain landscape, with its slight variations in elevation, and systematically engineered it into a managed, compartmentalized system using those longitudinal dikes along the river and the transverse dikes running inland. Each basin could function somewhat as an autonomous unit,
Right.
and managing them day to day was largely a local responsibility, handled at the village or district level. As we saw, this decentralization had both strengths, local knowledge, adaptability, and weaknesses, especially when the central authority weakened or the environment turned hostile. But this fundamental method of basin irrigation was incredibly resilient and sustainable, forming the basis of Egyptian agriculture for millennia.
So does all this point to the Old Kingdom being a classic hydraulic civilization, totally controlled top-down by a despotic state focused on water, as some older theories proposed?
While modern research, particularly the work of scholars like the late Carl Butzer who studied the environmental and geographical aspects, tends to push back against that strict Wittfogel-style hydraulic despotism model, at least for this early period.
Why is that?
The argument is that the day-to-day management of the basin irrigation system, while requiring organization, could largely be handled effectively at the local and provincial level. It wasn't strictly necessary for the Central Pharaonic state to micromanage every single dike and channel across the entire country to maintain its power over the populace through water control.
Okay.
The central government certainly did organize and execute the truly extraordinary large-scale projects, things like the legendary Memphis Dike, the huge pyramid harbors, the ambitious but failed Wadi Garawi Dam, and they undoubtedly intervened during national crises like the First Intermediate Period famine. But the routine, yearly cycle of basin irrigation seems to have had a very strong local component.
And we also saw real technological jumps, even if localized that copper plumbing in the temple, the engineered harbors for the pyramids.
Yes. They clearly demonstrated an understanding of basic hydrostatics water seeking its own level, which is crucial for designing canals with the right slope. And they could achieve precision water control on a smaller scale, like with those temple drains. These innovations, while they didn't result in large-scale perennial irrigation or massive storage dams in this period, definitely laid important groundwork and showed their engineering capabilities, setting the stage for the even more ambitious projects of the Middle Kingdom.
So wrapping up, what's the big takeaway about the impact of all this water management on Old Kingdom and Egyptian society?
Agriculturally, their ability to regulate the inundation using the basin system, the dikes, the canals, led to more predictable and significantly expanded farming compared to purely natural flooding. This fueled periods of remarkable prosperity and stability, like the height of the Pyramid Age in the 5th dynasty.
But it had a flip side.
Absolutely. The system was inherently vulnerable to the Nile's natural extremes. When the flood was too low for several years or catastrophically high, or crucially, when the essential human maintenance of the infrastructure failed, perhaps due to political instability, famine and social disruption were the direct, brutal consequences. We saw that clearly at the end of the Old Kingdom and throughout the First Intermediate Period. Sustainability was a constant negotiation between the river's fluctuations and continuous, organized human effort. Urban planning also had to integrate deeply with the Nile. Cities like Memphis were built on higher ground or artificial mounds or protected by massive dikes. Canals often ran through cities, providing transport routes and probably some drainage. You can easily imagine parts of these Nile cities during the high flood season feeling quite Venetian, with boats being a primary mode of getting around locally.
Interesting image.
And crucially, as we touched on, water management wasn't just a technical or administrative task. It was deeply woven into their societal and religious fabric. Nilometers were often associated with temples, tended by priests. The pharaoh's legitimacy, his connection to Ma'at, was partly demonstrated by ensuring a good flood. And successful water projects or heroic efforts by local leaders to provide water during drought were proudly recorded in tombs as major life achievements, showing how deeply respected competence in water management was. It was a core duty of leadership.
So from that almost mythical act of founding Memphis by diverting the river to the incredibly precise, almost modern-feeling copper pipes draining a temple floor, right down to local officials desperately digging canals to fight famine. It's just a story of immense human ingenuity, constant adaptation, and some very hard-won lessons.
It really is. It's one of the earliest and most compelling examples in history of a civilization fundamentally shaping its environment to survive and thrive. They worked closely with the powerful natural rhythms of the Nile, but they also learned, sometimes brutally, about the limits of their control and the dire consequences when those natural rhythms shifted unexpectedly or when their own essential human systems faltered. And their core methods, especially that incredibly adaptable basin irrigation system, formed a legacy that lasted for literally thousands of years, adapted and used by generations of subsequent rulers in Egypt.
This deep dive really shows us, doesn't it, that the Old Kingdom Egyptians weren't just focusing upwards, building these monumental pyramids reaching for the sky. They were equally focused downwards, on the ground, becoming incredibly sophisticated hydraulic engineers, adapting brilliantly to their unique, challenging riverine environment.
Their core approach was highly practical, and largely decentralized for the routine stuff, relying heavily on local communities to manage the essential basin irrigation day to day, while the central state stepped in for the really ambitious strategic interventions. And they clearly learned crucial lessons from both their successes and, maybe even more importantly, their failures, like that dramatic collapse of the Sad El Kafara Dam.
Yeah. And it's fascinating to see how even those seemingly simple systems, like the basin irrigation networks, required such constant, organized human maintenance, and how quickly the entire society could be plunged into crisis when that effort failed or nature didn't cooperate, as we saw so starkly during the First Intermediate Period drought and famine. We thought ingenuity on a truly grand scale, with projects like diverting rivers and creating those artificial harbors just to service the pyramid sites. And that also in these surprisingly detailed, almost modern-feeling innovations like the hidden copper plumbing found in Sahira's temple.
Yeah, their relationship with water was just so multifaceted. It wasn't just practical engineering for survival and building. It was profoundly woven into their administration, their religion, their art, their very identity as a civilization, utterly dependent on the Nile's yearly gift.
What stands out most to you, maybe, from this deep dive into their water world? Is it the sheer audacity of creating a working harbor right next to the Great Pyramid? Or maybe that unexpected discovery of copper drains from 4,500 years ago?
Yeah.
Think about this for a moment, everyone listening. That basic basin irrigation system, which they refined and managed during this early period, was so fundamentally effective and adaptable that it formed the backbone of Egyptian agriculture for literally millennia. It endured long after the Old Kingdom pharaohs were gone.
Which raises, I think, a really important question for us today, doesn't it? Considering the immense water management challenges we face globally now, with climate change driving more extreme droughts and floods, the need for sustainable urban water systems, feeding growing populations, what lessons, if any, can we actually draw from the ancient Egyptians' approach? Their particular balance between working with natural cycles rather than always against them, their reliance on local responsibility for routine management, their willingness to undertake strategic, large-scale interventions when necessary. How might understanding their ancient struggle, their successes and failures, inform our own increasingly complex relationship with our planet's vital water resources in the future?
A lot to chew on there indeed. Thanks everyone for joining us for this deep dive into the incredible and often surprising hydraulic world of Old Kingdom and First Intermediate Period Egypt. We hope you feel a little more well-informed.